Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Perez Art Museum, Miami. A big thank you to everyone joining us on YouTube today. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Today's program is available in ASL, American Sign Language, as well as Espanol and Creole translation via call-in numbers that will be placed in the YouTube chat. My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education, and I'm so happy to introduce our first program of Miami Art Week 2021. It's great to be back here. Our program today, NFTs, the next 500 years, featuring PAMM's Director of Digital Engagement, Jay Malika. Jay will moderate a panel with artist Sofia Crespo, curator Dr. Tina Rivers Ryan, and Art Block's CCO, Jeff Davis. It is quite fitting at this moment that we are coming together for this panel virtually, considering the state of the world's affairs. And NFTs certainly connect us to the very virtual and digital lives that we have all been living these past 20 plus months. And while NFTs have dominated the discourse around art this year, everything about them might be feeling opaque. How to obtain, define, and conserve NFTs are still confusing matters for many. So to get to the bottom of things, this panel will discuss how NFTs have changed the practice of digital art, where NFTs sit in the broader tradition of digital art, and where this all might be headed. Please join us also throughout this week for more stellar programming, both virtually and in person. Check out the lineup on our website at pamm.org. I do hope you can join us for those as well. Some acknowledgements before we get started. I would like to thank the incredible team of people that work so very hard to produce our PAMM education programs. I would like to acknowledge Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult Programs and Audience Engagement, and our world-class audio-visual team, Denise Faxis and Andrew Bird. We literally could not do this without you. Thank you. Now let's get this program started. Jay Malika is the Director of Digital Engagement at the Perez Art Museum, Miami. Before joining PAMM in 2020, he worked as a creative technologist at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where he led experiments in art and technology and modernized the museum's digital platforms. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Today Show, and Fast Company. In 2018, he won the Webby Award for the Best App from a cultural institution for his project, Send Me SF MoMA. Jay regularly writes about his work in museums, technology, design, and architecture. He holds a master's degree in interactive media art from NYU and is currently a visiting fellow at University of Miami's Institute for Data Science and Computing. Please note as well, we will have a short moment for questions at the end of the program today. So if you are joining us on YouTube, please post your questions in the comments or chat section, and our panel will try to answer as many as possible. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jay Malika.
Hi, Marie. Thank you for the generous introduction. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's program, NFTs, the next 500 years. My name is Jay Malika, and I'm the Director of Digital Engagement at the Perez Art Museum, Miami, better known to many as PAMM. I will be moderating this discussion today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues at PAMM for making this possible, in particular, Marie Vickles, Anita Bram, Denise Faxis, and Andrew Bird. I'd also like to mention some other things happening at PAMM this week. On Wednesday, December 1st at 2 p.m., we'll have another virtual discussion, an art talk between El Espacio 23 and PAMM across the Afro diaspora with Maria Elena Ortiz and Tandazani de la Cama. On Friday, December 3rd at 1 p.m., we'll have a hybrid, both virtual and in person, art talk between Marco Brambilla, the artist, and PAMM's director, Franklin Sermons. On Saturday, December 4th at 3:30 p.m., we'll have a hybrid panel titled Indigenous Contemporary Art. And on Sunday, December 5th at 2 p.m., we'll have a hybrid panel between Filmgate Miami and PAMM regarding the augmented reality experience Brianna's Garden. Please go to pamm.org/calendar for more information about these. I will be joined shortly by our panelists, the artist Sofia Crespo, curator Tina Rivers-Ryan, and ArtBlock's Chief Creative Officer, Jeff Davis. But first, I'd like to talk about why we felt it important to hold this panel in the first place. If you're tuning in today, it's likely because you found NFTs to be unavoidable this year. NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, have proven difficult to define, but according to Wikipedia, they are unique and non-interchangeable units of data stored on a blockchain. They can be associated with items such as photos, videos, audio, and other types of digital files, and kind of used as a sort of certificate of authenticity. And using blockchain, they give NFTs a public proof of ownership. The frenzy was kicked off in March with the nearly $70 million sale of Beeple's The First 5,000 Days and has continued unabated throughout 2021. By April, we were seeing reactions in the arts community to this hype. Transfer Gallery opened the first curated NFT exhibition titled Pieces of Me, organized in, quote, response to the aggregate hype of the emerging global NFT marketplace that interrogated not only exuberance surrounding NFTs, but also the emerging economics of NFT platforms. In the preceding months, NFTs withstood countless hype cycles and are now poised to dominate the discourse during Art Week here in Miami. PAMM is a museum concerned with modern and contemporary art practice. Thus, we at PAMM have been curious observers of this trend. The term NFT has come to connote aesthetics, objects, communities, and currencies, making the matter knotty and tough to untangle. As your moderator today, what I hope to accomplish is a triangulation of sorts. I'm less interested in determining if NFTs are totally good thing or totally bad thing, and more concerned with where this all sits in relation to broader historical context, how they have already changed how working artists operate, and what we might be able to project about the future of art considering these recent developments. Each of the panelists has had their career altered in some way by the emergence of NFTs. It is not often we find ourselves in the position to directly engage with a technology as it is being built. So we owe it to ourselves to scrutinize it while we can. We're going to speak with each of our panelists separately before entering a conversation with everyone. Then we'll take a few questions from the audience before we wrap things up. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. I'd like everyone to welcome Sofia Crespo, an artist working with an interest in biology-inspired technologies. One of her main focuses is the way organic life uses artificial mechanisms to simulate itself and evolve, this implying the idea that technologies are biased products of the organic life that created them and not a completely separated object. Crespo looks at the similarities between techniques of AI image formation and the way that humans express themselves creatively and cognitively recognize their world. Her work brings into question the potential of AI in an artistic practice and its ability to reshape our understanding of creativity. Tina Rivers-Ryan is an assistant curator at the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York. Her most recent exhibition, Difference Machines, Technology and Identity in Contemporary Art, co-curated with Paul Venus, featured 17 artists who explore the role of digital technologies in the production of difference. An art historian by training, Ryan has written extensively on the history of art and technology from the 1960s to the present for museums, including the Met, the Walker Art Center, and the Pirelli Hangar Bicocca. She is also an active critic who first wrote about the blockchain in 2016. Her essay, Token Gesture on the Meaning of NFTs for the History of Digital Art more broadly, appeared in the May 2021 issue of Artforum. Ryan holds 5 degrees in art history, including a BA from Harvard and a PhD from Columbia. Jeff Davis serves as the Chief Creative Officer at ArtBlocks, an NFT platform focused on genuinely programmable, on-demand, generative content that is stored immutably on the Ethereum blockchain. We'll get to that later. He is also the founder of Davis Editions, the author of 2 textbooks, Foundations of Design and Foundations of Color, and an artist who creates abstract work using algorithmic processes. Jeff's work has been exhibited at venues throughout the US. He currently lives in Tempe, Arizona with his wife and 2 children. All right, I'd like to begin with Sophia. Hi, Sophia, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
I think first, I'd like you to describe your practice and kind of explain it in layman's terms to everybody about how you create art.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction, and really happy to be here. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a generative artist, and my main focus point is nature and technology, the kind of relationship between them. Something that I really like to think about is what are the boundaries of my own imagination? How can I challenge those boundaries? And very often I would find myself trying to imagine a color that I've never been able to perceive before, and realizing that that's not possible because I've been determined to only be able to perceive a certain part of the light spectrum. So I found that machine learning was like a really good, or neural networks were a great set of tools for me, because they allowed me to kind of automatize the process of extracting patterns from a given data set. And in a way, it felt really organic to what was happening with my own imagination in parallel. So in a nutshell, that's what I do. I use neural networks to generate art.
Great. And in 2019 and 2020, you were getting a lot of attention for works such as Neural Zoo and the cyanotype prints that resulted. So what was it like, kind of, I want to understand what it was like being on the inside of digital art as the sort of NFT started to take over the discourse. What was it like for you sort of before and after NFTs hit?
Yeah, so for me, NFTs happened, like right when I was starting to just start to monetize my own work. And I was just starting to work for the first time with a gallery, and Kate Bass Gallery, and she introduced me to NFTs, where I didn't know anything about them, basically. And in a way, I think that I was lucky because I had somebody guide me through the process of minting a work, so I could ask kind of all the questions of what does this even mean? Who's gonna, how is this gonna be sold, and how will I get paid, and all of those questions. And I think that there were a lot of things that I had to kind of learn on the go, because nobody really teaches you how to deal with them. But I think they don't just apply to NFTs, they also apply to any kind of like sale of an artwork. So there are a lot of factors like, I would put a work that I really believe in, and then suddenly it doesn't sell for a while, and how to deal with the psychological factor of that, how to define like the worth of a piece. Maybe it means a lot to me, maybe I think it has a special kind of worth that doesn't translate to a price. So there were kind of a lot of things that I had to learn to navigate as part of that journey, and I think that they happened just through kind of they just happened with experience. I think I started learning, and also connecting to other artists was really an important part of it. But overall, as a digital artist, I think that NFTs were really empowering, because they help legitimize the fact that some of my works are JPEGs, and and they can have worth. Whereas before, I didn't think, I saw, like, I had people ask me, like, how do you even sell your work? And I said, well, I have to print it, I have to create a physical object. But I like very much the fact that those kind of files can be available to be seen, like on my Instagram or my Twitter, but they can have an owner, and yeah, I think that helps legitimize a lot what the digital art practice
Yeah, and you said
Yeah.
I want to ask, kind of dig in a little bit further. You said some of your output is JPEGs, but you work with a wide variety of output. And did you find that the emergence of NFTs sort of changed your process a little bit to, or what you were making, or did it has that not changed much for you?
So I think that like there is one kind of limiting aspect. I would say like something that's limiting is that some of my pieces are very high resolution and they're very heavy files, and it's often like quite difficult to mint that on the blockchain. So if it affected, I would say like, yeah, very often I had to just compress an artwork that I wish could be much larger just to fit that particular, like limitation. But apart from that, I'm still doing what I like to do and what I believe in. And I think they have also changed the fact that that I can earn something from them, from that work. So it has motivated me to work further on that.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia. I'm going to move on to Jeff now, and he'll provide some context about the emergence of NFT platforms. And hi, Jeff, how are you doing?
Hi, good to be here.
Nice to have you. Can you give us a little history on the rise of NFT platforms?
Sure. I mean, I guess from my vantage point, so I started exploring NFTs about 3 years ago as an artist. I think there's a platform called Super Rare. I think they started following me on Twitter or something, and I was curious what it was and checked out their site. And I had a very similar kind of reaction to it as Sophia described. So I'm a generative digital artist, and previously I would create prints of my work and explore exhibition opportunities at galleries and that sort of thing. And so this concept of like starting digital and keeping it digital, that the artwork could be a digital asset versus just some artifact of the digital art that I was making, was really, really intriguing to me. So I started experimenting on Super Rare. It was about 3 years ago. I don't know how long they had been operational before that. I would guess a year or two, even prior to me discovering it. And then there's been several platforms in that same sort of area. Known Origin, Maker's Place, Foundation is a similar platform, a little more recent. And then those all are kind of you have to be accepted onto those platforms. So you apply as an artist and or an invite system. And then you can, once you're on, then you can start minting your artwork. And then there's also OpenSea and Rarible, which are more secondary platforms for resale of works, but they also allow artists more of an open fashion to just come to their site and start minting artwork. So there's been a lot of platforms, and focusing on different either aesthetics or different approaches to how they were working with artists. And so that's been several years in the making.
And so what kind of technologies made them possible? And tell me a little bit about how Art Blocks fits into all of this and what Art Blocks provides or differentiates, how they differentiate themselves in this field.
Sure. Yeah. So generally with all the platforms that I mentioned, from an artist standpoint, the way you would what's called minting an NFT, which is the creation of an NFT, basically putting it onto the blockchain, creating the token for it. You would come to the site, you would upload a media file of some sort, a JPEG, a video file, whatever the kind of file type of the artwork is. And you'd upload that with some associated metadata, and that would create your NFT. And so all the marketplaces I mentioned are all Ethereum-based marketplaces, which is I would say the primary blockchain for where NFTs are sort of living and breathing at the moment. There are other blockchains too. Tezos is a big one that a lot of artists are using now as well. But so what differentiates art blocks is that instead of a sort of media-based NFT, art blocks NFTs are code-based NFTs. And so we primarily work with generative artists who, instead of uploading a media file, they upload a script. So that's what we are showing on screen right now. This is from a recent project by one of our artists called Ben Kovac. The project's called Edifice. And so these are just some snippets of the code that he uploaded to the blockchain. And then art blocks, instead of seeing the artwork in advance, you come to the project with a kind of a sense of what it looks like, but you create the work on demand. So your transaction on the Ethereum blockchain is what actually realizes the work based on the artist's algorithm. So the artist is creating a framework for the creation of artwork instead of creating specific artworks. And then the collector comes and actually generates the work through their transaction with the project. So these are examples of the Edifice algorithm. So as more pieces are minted, then the series slowly starts to reveal itself. So this was the first one, and the next slide will show the next couple. And so as people create the work, then you start to understand the nature of the project and start seeing the sort of the framework that the artist has built out through their code.
Great. And then do you like how kind of funny questions, but you and Sophia both mentioned that you were both working in digital art before this, and in order to sort of earn income, you had to create a physical representation of your digital thing. And so do you see NFTs as an inevitable sort of kind of development in the world of digital art? And
yeah, I do. I mean, I think, not the specific, I guess, technology of NFTs, but sort of the concept of it, the idea that you could have a digital asset that can exist as the work of art, that it can be transferred, it can be owned. I just think as we're becoming a more digitally native society, there's just people are going to want ownership of digital assets in the digital lives that they lead. And so I think NFTs provides that for art and other things as well. But so I think we've been primed for something of this nature for a while now.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to move on to Tina now. And Tina comes from Brighton Knox. And so I would love it if you could place NFTs in the broader tradition of digital art for us.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to be on this panel, Jay. And thank you.
It's great to have you.
To both Sophia and Jeff for your comments. I was taking some notes. I'm really excited for the conversation after this. So we're now going to have a very brief art history lesson. So hopefully this doesn't completely bore people, but I do like to bring in some of the history of digital art into the conversation around NFTs, because I think for a lot of people who are just coming to art through NFTs, they may not be aware of some of this history. And also some people who have been operating in the so-called mainstream contemporary art world for a while also may only be learning about the digital art community and the history of digital art through NFTs, which is quite presentist, right? The whole point is about generating income, as Sophia and Jeff have both talked about, for contemporary digital artists. But in fact, digital art is something that has a 50-year history. And so I'm just going to briefly go over some highlights of that. So what you're seeing on the screen here are 3 books from my collection, and I think you can still probably track these down somewhere on the internet if you would like to get your own copies. So these are from the early 1970s, and these are all examples of books written by artists and curators about this early moment of digital art in the 1960s, when artists first began using computers creatively. And I won't talk too much about that history, but if we can go to the next slide, please. 2 of the artists that you often hear cited as real leaders, pioneers in this field are Vera Molnar and Manfred Moore. And I would just like to say that, I'm picking out these two artists in particular because their practice might be called generative, depending on how you want to define that term. And one of the things I really love about art blocks, for example, and what Art Blocks is doing is they're creating a space for people to learn about and talk about the history of these practices. And so just a shout out to everyone who is in their Discord and on the Generative Art History channel. It's been really great to see people either bringing their knowledge of this history or discovering this history sort of in real time. Next slide, please. So those examples I just showed you by Vera and Manfred are, basically works on paper that were output using a plotter printer. But artists have also been thinking about what we now call the metaverse for quite some time. So artists have been making art that's sort of generative for a while, but also they have been thinking about virtual space, virtual reality, how we inhabit a digital space. And so I'm showing you here a solo exhibition that the artist Matt Mulliken had at MoMA in 1989, untitled, but referred to as the Computer Project. And basically it was a display of a video and a series of light boxes with reproductions from a virtual world that he created with the help of a computer company. And if anybody's interested in learning more, I wrote an essay for Matt's recent show in Milan about this particular project. So just to say that we've been, having these conversations for a while, and I think it can be helpful to go back to understand how that, the future was imagined before. Next slide, please. So we also have a long history of artists thinking about networks as creative mediums, artists thinking about artworks that truly are of and on the network. So not merely taking a work of art and posting it online or using NFTs or the internet to financialize, to transact, but really thinking about what it means to create art on the internet. And so I'm showing you here some early examples from the 1980s of artists like Robert Adrian and Roy Ascott and Sherry Rabinowitz and Kit Galloway, who basically pioneered using different kinds of telecommunications technologies, whether it's the Artex system, which is sort of an early artist-centered internet, or other kinds of internets, or even satellite communications, all before the World Wide Web came into prominence in the 90s. Next slide, please. So speaking of the web, one of the most famous internet-based works of art is this sentence by Douglas Davis called The World's First Collaborative Sentence from 1994. It was basically a digital update of the surrealist Exquisite Corpse, if you're familiar with that game. So everybody on the internet gets to add their own text. And I can talk about this more later when we talk about institutions, because this work is now in the collection of the Whitney Museum. But I just wanted to point out that not only have artists been thinking about making work online, they've also been thinking about online communities and the way that people can come together and create collectively on the internet since the 1990s. Next slide. I also like talking about this work because, in fact, this is a work that was immediately bought. And I just like to point out that the history of buying and selling digital art, it's complicated. It certainly is the case that digital art has never had the market that it has now, thanks to NFTs. It's certainly the case that it has not been a very highly financially valued aspect of contemporary art. But that does not mean that it was never bought or sold or acquired by private collectors or institutions. So I'm just showing you on the screen here, Douglas Davis's statement from 2000, which is on the Whitney's website, about how these collectors, the Schwartzes, purchased this collaborative sentence from him and then donated it to the Whitney Museum. Next slide, please. There's also a history of artists who have been using the blockchain that predates NFTs. So I'm showing this exhibition that I wish more people were citing as an important part of the history, called Proof of Work at the Schinkel Pavilion in 2018. And a lot of people who I think of as being real thought leaders in this space, including Simon Denny and Harm van den Dorpel and Sam Hart, were, sort of came together in this kind of distributed authorship mode to organize this exhibition of art that was about the blockchain as well as on it. So even the history that is just 5 years old or less, I think we need to look to and reacquaint ourselves with as part of this larger conversation. And for me, the most exciting thing about the emergence of NFTs is the fact that now there are so many more people who are interested in having these conversations, who want to not only acquire digital art, but also appreciate digital art and learn about its history. And so that's really, for me, the best possible outcome of this development, along with artists being able to, pay their rent. That's also pretty fantastic. If I can go to the next slide, I do have a few more slides really quickly to talk about something that I would like to see emerging in the space. So part of the history of digital art includes very I want to say political, I don't know if there's a better word, but people who were thinking about the way that internet technologies were shaping society, whether it was, emergent globalization, neoliberalization, thinking about how our economies were developing because of the internet, and who sort of weaponized the internet to critique, to unpack these emerging technologies, basically. So here you see this work by Electronic Disturbance Theater called FloodNet, and this was a coordinated DDoS attack in sort of on behalf of the Zapatistas in Mexico. Next slide, please. Shulia Cheng's work, Brandon, which was commissioned by the Guggenheim Museum, an important online artwork that combined physical display, virtual space, performances, digital assets, text, images, in order to explore basically identity as it is online. Next slide. This work by Mendy and Keith Obadike called Blackness for Sale, which really critiqued the default whiteness of the internet, the way that the internet early on was already being imagined as a space that was essentially white by default, and also critiquing the way that identities were being commercialized by the internet. And I think there's a fascinating through line between this work and the concept of branding now with NFTs, where in many cases, really what you're selling is your personal brand. We've seen the sort of amplification of that thanks to NFTs. And next slide. Eva and Franco Matas, who are also thinking about commercialization in institutions. So they released this virus at the Venice Biennale. And to me, this work is very much about how digital art is not something that can be easily contained. It's something that wants to escape the confines of the art gallery. It's something that wants to be mutable. It's something that wants to be contingent. It's something that wants to be ephemeral and active. And so next slide, and this is the last work I think I'll mention. Speaking of institutionalization, there was a very famous exhibition of early net art at Documenta X, which is a major contemporary art survey that happens every 5 years in Germany. And at the end of Documenta X, the organizers basically tried to sell a CD-ROM. They took all of the works offline and then tried to sell a CD-ROM of those works. And so one of these artists, Vukosik, who basically invented the term net art, in protest, cloned the site and then put up a dupe that's still available online. And so just the spirit of digital art wanting to be free, digital art resisting commercialization, digital art resisting ossification, digital art, sort of having a complicated relationship with institutions. So that is a history that I want us to think about more as we think about what's next for digital art. And I'll finally mention that if anyone's interested in the concept of identity as it relates to digital art, so if you can put on my last slide, as Jay mentioned, I co-curated this exhibition, Difference Machines, with the artist Paul Vanus that's currently on view in Buffalo. So if anybody can make it up here before January 16th, we have a little bit of snow on the ground, but only like half an inch. I welcome you guys to come to Buffalo. We also have extensive resources on our website that will allow you to learn more about all of the works of art and the artists in the show. So that was my mini lecture about digital art history, but hopefully we see some points of connection into what's going on now with NFTs, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Tina. We're all a little bit smarter now. I thought it was interesting that, especially the example about the website that was kind of ossified and distributed on a CD, but then the CDs, as we know, are sort of, behind the times. And the URL, however, has stayed up this whole time. Another interesting thing, though, is that you were sharing some screenshots of things that don't exist as URLs as they were. They exist on archive.org or something like that. So even the URL as the sort of fixed unit of sharing is also subject to change over the years. And then I'd like to open it up to the broader panel now. I think I want to start with a question about institutional sort of acceptance or institutional interest in NFTs. It's still a very new technology, but we've already kind of get the sense that museums and other institutions have been slow to accept NFTs, but the ICA in Miami famously acquired a cyberpunk NFT, and as now the San Jose Museum of Art also has an NFT. And so I'd like to start with, maybe Tina can start and say, like, why have institutions been slow to kind of react or accept them? And then we can move on to the rest of the group to see what maybe the future of this is.
Sure. It's an interesting question. I will say, first of all, it makes a lot of sense that Miami and San Jose would be the cities where you have museums getting in on NFTs, because both of those institutions are in cities where they have a very strong tech sector. And a good collection is always thinking about not only engaging a national and international discourse of contemporary art, but also thinking about its community. And so that makes a lot of sense. I will say, beyond those two places, we should understand that most major museum acquisitions take years to develop. It's a very long process that involves identifying artists of potential interest, doing studio visits, getting a sense of their market, then identifying which work would be the right one to come into the collection, negotiating price, and then putting that acquisition forward to various committees for internal approval. So even if museums did immediately jump on NFTs, we're talking about something that's really only come to their attention about 6 months ago. So we still may not see those acquisitions for another 3 months. I'm just thinking about the normal timeline of an acquisition process. Another thing I'll point out is that, the mandate of museums is to acquire work of lasting cultural significance. And with something that's so new, many of these artists are emerging. Many of these artists have not been, not all of them, but a lot of these artists, especially the ones that, you're hearing about, who have the major auction records, they have not been, making art necessarily for all that long. And so a museum, can't always bet on an emerging artist. We like to sort of take our time and to make sure that what we're acquiring is something that we are totally convinced will be of that lasting cultural relevance. So that's also playing into it too. And then finally, I just wonder about, I think museums should be acquiring digital art for sure, but whether the NFT is either necessary or sufficient to that process is a question. And I'm not talking about the works of art where the NFT is actually the artwork, where, it's, the NFT is basically the medium and it's created on chain. I'm talking more about like a JPEG that is, sold with an NFT. I think that museums for now would feel more comfortable acquiring a digital artwork with a traditional certificate of authenticity and a traditional transfer of assets rather than embracing the NFT, which is such an unproven sort of long-term technology. So
thanks, Tina.
Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Jeff, is institutional support something that is even on the radar for art blocks at this point, or,
I mean, sure, we're having lots of conversations, but I think generally I agree with Tina that it's so early, and so I don't, I think you had framed the question like institutions are slow or whatever, and I don't actually think that's the right positioning. I think it's just it's so new, and it does take a while for people to make sense of what's going on. I think it's really important that there is a critical dialogue that develops around the space through exactly what we're doing here today. I mean, these sorts of things need to happen for the broader public, the broader art community to understand what NFTs are, what their place is relative to other art forms. And so that just takes time. And so I think we're heading in that direction. And so as far as art blocks goes, yeah, we feel that we're championing not, a work of art that maybe has been underappreciated since it's come onto the scene. And so we also feel that in addition to not just NFT technology, but the idea of generative art being a recognizable art form to the broader art community is another part of our message. So we're kind of playing two roles, I'd say, at Artblocks. We're both championing NFT technology, but also generative art, code-based art as an art form too.
Yeah, that's great. And Sophia, where do you see your work fitting into the broader, I guess, institutional thing? You've shown a lot in, you've shown in museums and galleries, but is institutional support something that you look for through acquisition, or is it something that's more important to just be shown in exhibition for you right now?
I think that I would like to have some more institutional support in the future. I think I'm still kind of at the beginning of my art career, so that's not something that's there yet. Yeah, but for me right now, I think like the exhibitions are one of the most important things that I'm focusing on.
Okay, great. So one last question before we move on to some Q&A, and I just was wondering what everybody thinks about where the future of NFTs is. Do you think that we're going to see some of this hype subside, or do you think that we're in this, it's only going to get more, permeate the art world more and more as we go along?
I'll jump in. So I do think because of the fact that it's tied to blockchain and cryptocurrencies, that there is a cyclical nature to it, the way sort of assets flow in and out of the space. But I think long term, generally, it's just going to be an expanding growth area. And I have a, I don't have a sort of us versus them or sort of a antagonistic sort of philosophy to NFTs and how they sit, relative to the contemporary art world. I just think it's another medium, another art form, and will just ultimately sit alongside, painting, sculpture, whatever. It's not necessarily like it's going to take over and win or something like that. So I think it's a growing area, and I think there's plenty of room for it, but I also don't think of art as being a zero-sum game either. So I think there's room for everybody.
Does anybody else want to comment on that, where they see NFTs in 5 or 10 years?
I mean, I agree with what Jeff said. I think that, what we've seen is basically the overnight emergence of a parallel art market and a parallel art world with its own, canon, its own artists, its own institutions, its own exhibitions. And, art, digital art for a long time has basically been a kind of parallel art world of its own that has its own museums like Ars Electronica and ZKM. It has its own festivals. It has its own networks of distribution, its own most famous artists, and it sometimes intersects with the contemporary art world, and that's a place where I operate, right? And so I think what we're going to see moving forward is that basically we will continue to have sort of a traditional art market and art world, and the crypto art market and art world, and good, interesting art will sort of cross barriers and move back and forth. And as for the market beyond that, I mean, whether or not the entire art market moves to being blockchain based, like whether all auctions in the future will be blockchain based, even a traditional auction of a painting, I think that sort of remains to be seen. But I'm not the expert who could weigh in on that.
Thank you. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience now. One of these is kind of around conservation. Ivan Frank has asked, how do we get ahead of digital rot? And brings up an important sort of question about conservation of NFTs, talk about links to JPEGs disappearing if a platform goes down, or even the sort of questions about, is the immutability of the blockchain a good thing? Is it beneficial to be immutable when details about an artist's life or work might change or be discovered? Does anybody want to speak to that?
I mean, as an institutional curator, I definitely can. So, one of the interesting things about the NFT is that in those cases, on those platforms in which actual legal ownership is not being transferred, right? So many of the terms and conditions on the platform state that you're only acquiring the NFT, you're not actually acquiring either the intellectual property to the work, which is almost never transferred in art sales anyway, or the artwork itself, that the artwork itself often, is retained by the artist. So one thing that's really interesting about that is that it allows the artist to monetize their practice without actually losing control of their art. And it was Wade Wallerstein of Transfer Gallery and now also Gray Area, who pointed out that in a sense, this is great for artists. They get to sort of double dip, right? They can sell their work on chain as a token, and then they could also turn around and sell their work off chain to a collector. And transfer legal title. The only issue with this is that when you sell a work of art, you are also transferring a moral and in some cases legal responsibility to act as steward for that artwork in the future. And that doesn't just mean, saving it to my hard drive. It means maintaining documentation, iteration reports, interviewing the artist to figure out what their wishes are for long-term conservation, the degree to which the technology is integral or is mutable or variable. And so it takes a lot of work actually to conserve digital art for the long term. And I'm very excited by things like Protean DAO, with Regina Harsanyi, who's a digital art conservator, is trying to develop sort of industry-wide best practices for the conservation of NFTs and for digital assets. So that's great. But the problem is, if I'm not actually selling you my artwork with my NFT, then who is left with that responsibility? And if the responsibility remains with the artist, well, then what happens? Who inherits that responsibility when the artist dies? So these are questions that I think we need to be thinking about. Not all NFT artists may want to be thinking about these questions. Maybe it doesn't matter to them. But for those who are interested in the conservation of their work in the long term, then we need to be having some more conversations about that. And so I think like Ferrophile, for example, is a really interesting platform because it does sort of spell out what kind of rights are given to the collector and encourages people to think about that and sort of act with a little more intention, I guess.
All right, thank you, Tina.
And if I could jump in a little bit on how Artblocks operates, because we do things a little different. As we mentioned, I kind of hinted at this earlier, but a lot of NFTs are media files that are essentially uploaded to like distributed databases for hosting the file. And then the NFT is essentially a sort of a marker that points at where that file is located. At Artblocks, we don't have any media assets in our NFTs. So the artist actually puts their script on chain, and then the collector receives what's called a random hash, but it's the basically the randomization that provides all the decision making in the script that the artist provides. And then Artblocks points those things at each other, and we render the artwork live for the artist in real time. And so in our case, there's actually, as long as Ethereum exists as a blockchain, our artwork will exist. There's nothing to be lost or, sense of digital rot. We do have a few dependencies in the fact that we require, JavaScript to survive, web browsers to survive, and we do have a few scripting dependencies that they're widely distributed and we think will survive. We're also even looking at what it looks like to put those sorts of things on chain. So essentially for us, as long as Ethereum exists, we believe our artwork will survive as well. So
you touch upon an interesting aspect of this. So far, the sort of concerns about conservation around NFTs have been, will this link disappear or not? But really, if we think about sort of aspects of digital art like resolution, what you see, like your JPEG may look very crisp today, but 10 years from now, will it still hold up? And so you can't really swap that out for another high-res JPEG in 10 years. If you think about the sort of resolution you were seeing in video games 10 years ago versus today, you can kind of get an understanding of how rapidly these screen resolutions have been advancing. I have a question for Sophia, though. Somebody from the audience is asking, is the underlying art piece necessarily digital art, or can it be a traditional painting or sculpture? We have seen instances where people are trying to sell physical objects. I was just wondering what your experience with that was.
Yeah, I think that the underlying piece could be anything, really. I've even considered like tokenizing a work that was originally digital, then printed by hand, and then the scan of that work. So it's kind of like a strange loop there where it returns to a digital format, but I think it could take any shape you want. And just to add a comment on what you were previously saying, I think it's really interesting to think about like the obsolescence of certain technologies, because in AI, things just move so fast that dependencies that worked like a couple of years ago, they don't work anymore now. So, so like AI code is constantly advancing so fast, and it's just kind of an interesting fact about like working with new technologies. Everything feels very impermanent because it's changing very fast. And I think like being in that field, I find that very fascinating and thrilling, because it's constantly kind of, I have to learn new things, but it's very important to think about this for a collector as well, to know like, am I buying a work that, I'll be able to show 10 years from now somewhere? I think it's a relevant question, but I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophia. We have some other questions. We have somebody asking, besides bringing new audiences and attention to digital and generative art, why would the blockchain/crypto be necessary for creating markets for digital art? And we kind of touched upon this already, where there wasn't really a way to do this before, but maybe Jeff could speak to this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for artists who want to keep their work in a digital format and make it available to collectors, it was tricky, I guess, at best before. And like I kind of mentioned this, you would have to make physical artifacts or, CD-ROMs or, some way of transferring that, object to someone who was interested, say, in purchasing it or acquiring it. And blockchain just makes that all very seamless, very transparent, very public. And it's also one of the benefits of working digitally is when you remove physicality from it, you remove the limitations of physicality. So I think back in generative projects that I would have done in the past, I'd be limited by the number of prints I could produce, the cost of the prints, and the physical exhibition space where I could show those. So I'd work in series of 20 at a time. But now working 100% digitally, I can think about producing series of 100 or 1,000 or whatever the number may be. So it does additionally being able to stay in a digital format opens up new doors and new territories that aren't explorable, otherwise.
Thank you. Yeah,
Jay, can I just jump in on that real quick? Because this question I think is a really important one. In fact, I was just on Twitter debating this morning about the degree to which crypto and or the blockchain are necessary for creating and sustaining a digital art market. And I just want to point out, I understand Sophia and Jeff are both talking about, how they felt pressure to create physical versions of their artworks in order to sell them. But museums have been acquiring digital video files that are just transmitted as digital videos without any material substrate for a while now. That's actually not very controversial. And so I just want to point out that there are alternate models, and that I don't actually see the NFT, for example, as necessary. I think it's certainly the case that the platforms have made the whole process of transacting digital art more seamless than the traditional gallery system, which it can be a good thing in some ways, like transparency, and it can be a problem in other ways, like lack of control over your market. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of add that in, but I also defer to artists because I know you guys have been really frustrated by the lack of a market for a long time, and that, it would be silly not to sort of explore the new market that's been afforded by these cryptocurrencies. So I get it, but it is not the only way.
Thank you, Tina. So here's another question from the audience. This one's about how do we display NFTs? We've seen a lot of kind of awkward photographs of screens and galleries, and what are the current ways NFTs are shown as ways that it could or should or hope they hope to be shown in the future? Does this mean more screens and galleries for people, or is it something different than that?
Well, I've been, go ahead, Sophia. No, you go ahead, Sophia, please.
No, I just wanted to say, I think displaying works is an art of its own, because very often I find that one of the issues I have is the screens usually, how do you get screens that fit every particular artwork? It's almost impossible. I work in weird formats sometimes that aren't standards. So there's usually black padding around them, which drives me crazy. If I show a square video and there's a black padding on a TV, or then you show them in a projection, but then the light conditions, there's so many variables there. I know many people say that VR or AR will be more and more pervasive there, but we don't have that at the moment in a kind of accessible way to show work with in VR that's at a kind of nice enough resolution. So I think it's hard to say but I know that as an artist, it's something that really drives me crazy to see how they will be shown.
There's this silly idea that conserving or storing digital art is easier than other kinds of art. And there's also this very silly idea that installing digital art is somehow easier or cheaper than other kinds of art. And it's not the case at all.
It's harder.
It's harder.
I was going to say, I agree that, goes back. I had a very similar comment earlier just about, institutional adoption, but just in terms of the display or sharing of NFTs also very, very early. So I think there's a lot of room for trying to get NFTs out of people's laptops and figure out what that looks like to put them on walls and share them with people, whether it's virtually or in physical spaces. So.
Although also, I mean, Brian Drucker had an interesting comment. He wrote us, for people who are interested in this question, he wrote a 2-part series of articles for Art in America about exhibitions of NFT art, both sort of online and IRL. And, he pointed out that like seeing an NFT on my laptop is also a display. It is also a mode of display, right? And so the question then becomes, when you take that work and you try to show it in an institutional context or a different architectural envelope or in dialogue with other kinds of art or other histories, like then what happens, right? But not to sort of discount, like I just don't want to, and not, Jeff, not that you were saying this, but I think people have this idea that the NFT is not displayed unless it's output to some monitor or whatever. But the whole point about digital art actually is it exists in different contexts and that your laptop is one of them.
Yeah, or your phone. I mean, just imagine that you have an art collection on your phone, and it's just a new way, of thinking about how you collect and own artwork.
Exactly. And you just have to be really intentional.
Yes, Sophia?
No, something that I wanted to is like, it's funny because I just now made for the first time an NFT piece that is both like the collector receives the file to be displayed, adapted to like a standard monitor, and the other one is like the original piece, like to just the token. And yeah, it's exactly because of this kind of like wanting to have secured like that piece for display and that piece for like original, kind of like the original token.
Since we're almost out of time, can I actually ask Sophia a question?
Yeah, go for it, Tina. This will be, okay, well, yeah.
Can you talk more about the work that you're showing in Miami this week? Because I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, I'm showing one of my first series. It's called Neural Zoo. And this is exactly the one where I mentioned like about the display. So we'll be showing like a series of 10 works at Untitled, which is like an art fair in Miami Beach as part of Art Basel.
I won't miss that. Yeah. Sure.
I don't want to take much more time talking about this.
I just want to close on one last question. I know we're over time now, but I'm going to kind of invert everything and sort of ask the meta question last. One of the audience members asked, how do you think legacies of artists with NFTs will be defined? And I guess that sort of feeds into the more broader sort of confusion about what is an NFT? Is it an aesthetic, a community, a financial object, or what? So I don't think anybody here would define themselves as an NFT artist, but I think there are folks who do. But how do you see NFTs fitting into your broader legacy? And I guess Sophia can speak to that.
I think NFTs, like I don't know where to begin. Like it's kind of like hopefully they outlive me. I guess like that's like hopefully they stay up there somewhere where people can still see them. And but yeah, like as an artist, I think for me, like it's important to think of a way in which like my art can kind of preserve or stay somewhere after I'm dead. I know this is kind of a very dark take on it, but I think often about like how will that happen and what shape will it take? And yeah, it all depends on kind of like digital technologies. And yeah, we were previously talking, so I don't specifically have like a one single answer to say like what will happen. But
so you just see it as a way to maybe preserve your art into the future. It's like as maybe one of many possible ways even. And
but also I think that to establish like ownership or to kind of legitimize the work in a way that
Provenance.
Provenance, exactly.
All right.
Yeah, I would say that, for me, it'd be like, just in terms of my own artwork, but also the work I'm doing at Art Blocks it's sort of, I don't know, NFTs are a vehicle, I guess. And so I think long-term, it's not necessarily going to be NFT art, it's art. And so how do you recognize the legacy of any artist, regardless of the mode that they operate in? I do think there'll be, a bit of it where, I do believe that NFTs are here to stay as a vehicle for the, distribution of digital art. And so, there probably will be a bit of history around being at the beginning of this, movement or whatever you want to call it, that we were early in the adoption and forwarding of NFTs as technology, as an art form. But then beyond that, I think hopefully it's just, we all get evaluated in the same way that any other contemporary artist who's, working in this time would be evaluated.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated question, but it is sort of the $69 million question, I guess. I mean, I just keep saying, like, whose canon, whose values, whose art history are you talking about? There are multiple, worlds, art worlds, even within the mainstream contemporary art world. There are multiple art worlds. And there are multiple art history textbooks. There are multiple canonical narratives. Not to say that things don't sort of shake out, but I think that, what we need to have now is a real soul-searching conversation about what values we want to see prioritized moving forward. And it's not necessarily the case that the traditional values of the art world will prevail. It's not necessarily the case that so-called crypto art, which doesn't really, as we've sort of been saying, like, it's not necessarily even a thing, but there is certainly like a genre of tokenized art that I think fits that term. It's not necessarily that it's totally incompatible. I think that the tools of art history and art criticism can be brought to bear on any artwork, regardless of medium, regardless of how it's financialized. But we'll see basically who wants to be part of that process and which values are going to be put forward. And that all has to be negotiated. And I think that just as we have multiple art worlds, we will wind up with multiple canons and multiple markets that will value things differently, financially and culturally. So for example, like, Jeff was just mentioning sort of like the historic projects, like, Bored Apes will always be very important within the canon of tokenized collectibles, right? Whether Bored Apes will become important within the art history canon is very much a question, but there can be multiple canons. And it's just important to constantly be very upfront about the values that you're bringing to the table in the act of judgment. I cite a lot this Jason Bailey piece from 2018, What is Crypto Art?, where he points out that crypto art does not want to be subject to traditional art historical evaluation. So what does it want to be subject to? Well, he has different criteria that he puts forward. And so, yes, this is a conversation that needs to happen. And so I'm very hopeful about initiatives like the current museum, that are trying to create a space for that to happen.
All right, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, Sophia, Jeff, and Tina. We're over time now, so we're going to wrap it up. And thank you to everybody who joined us today on the live broadcast. Please go to pam.org/calendar to see what we are also doing the rest of this week.